and welcome to the Ukraine Shelf, a podcast hosted by the UCL European Institute, produced in collaboration with University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Ukrainian Institute London, and supported by the British Academy. My name is Dr. Olesa Chromoychuk, and I'm a writer and a historian and the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. And I'm joined by my co-presenter and co-creator of the podcast, Dr. Uyan Blacker, associate professor in Ukrainian and East European culture at UCL.
In each episode of the Ukraine Shelf, together with our guests, we'll seek out the best books about Ukraine that are already available in English and also think about those that should be translated from Ukrainian or other languages. And we'll be adding all these books to the Ukraine Shelf and hoping that this shelf will also appear in our listeners' libraries. This is the second episode of the Ukraine Shelf, and we really encourage you to listen to the first one, which focused on Crimea, and in particular on literature about Crimean Tatar history and culture and the relationship between Ukraine and Crimea historically and in the present. And we had an amazing conversation with Professor Rory Finnan and Elmaz Azan, both based at the University of Cambridge. And you can find that episode by Googling UCL European Institute podcast or via your usual podcast provider.
Today we have two brilliant guests who will speak about two very important books. Joining us in the studio is Dr. Sasha Dovzhyk, Ukrainian writer and curator, director of a new institution called Index, Institute for Documentation and Exchange, and editor of London Ukrainian Review. And Eugene Finkel, Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, and he's joining us from Bologna. Welcome both.
Hello, so nice to be here with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we'll be discussing two books today, which are in many ways very different books. One is a work of history, and that's Eugene's book Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-year quest to dominate Ukraine, which was published in 2024 by Basic Books. And the second is a book of non-fiction, which is about the present, really. It's about the current war, and it's by Victoria Amelina, Ukrainian writer, war crimes investigator. And the title is Looking at Women, Looking at War, and it's just been published by Harper Collins. And the books are very different in terms of their focus, in terms of their genre, certainly, in terms of their style, but they're also connected to one another in very important ways. And I should say that the Victoria Amelina's book was produced by a team, an editorial team, and Sasha Dovzhyk was a central part of that team of bringing that book into publication. Now, Eugene's book traces the history of Russian imperial and Soviet attempts to crush Ukraine as a state, to crush Ukraine as an idea in many ways, to crush Ukrainian culture, identity, language, and so on. And this often involved, of course, the persecution of Ukrainian intellectuals, activists, writers, in many cases, the murder of those people. And Victoria Amelina's book talks precisely to those sorts of people in the present, in the context of the current war. She speaks in the book to women who are resisting Russia's aggression in all kinds of areas, from international law to working as medics or soldiers on the front line, as volunteers, as writers, indeed. And of course, as many of our listeners will no doubt know, Victoria herself was one of those people, and very, very tragically, she was killed in a Russian missile attack in 2023. Thus sharing the fate of many of those figures described indeed in Eugene's book. And it's for that reason that the book was published posthumously and had to be produced and brought to the reader by this editorial team, of which Sasha was a central part. So we have a very powerful and also a very, of course, tragic sense of continuity between the two books. And I think it would be useful for us at the beginning of our conversation, in order to understand the connection between the history and the present, between the two books, if we go back to the beginnings of this story. And Eugene, your book refers to the full-scale invasion of 2022 as the latest episode in a centuries-long campaign. So maybe to begin with, could you tell us a bit more about this long-term perspective and how it helps us to go back 100, 200 years, even further back into the past to understand what's happening today?
Right, absolutely. So, I'm not an historian. I'm a political scientist by training, and I never imagined writing a history book. What I wanted to understand was mostly the current war. When I started the Russian violence against civilians in Ukraine, because, it puzzled me. There was obviously a clear disconnect between the Russian rhetoric about liberation, about, denazification, about Russian speakers being oppressed in Ukraine, and the actual violence on the ground often targeted against these very people. So that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to understand. What drove it? But I started in 2022. Obviously, almost immediately understood that I can't do just 2022. I moved to 2014. It wasn't enough. I went to 1990s, and eventually I started going back in time until I hit early mid 19th century and figured out that there is a very consistent set of Russian ideas about Russia and about Ukraine that drive Russian policies towards Ukraine, and those policies have several components, but what unites them is a sense of Russian ownership over Ukraine. Sometimes it can be physical ownership, sometimes it can be historical or cultural ownership, but from the Russian perspective, and everyone who knows the history of the conflict, they don't see Ukrainians as a real people. Ukrainians are either little Russians or an invention. They see Ukraine as a Russian territory that has been taken away from Russia. They see Ukrainian as just a dialect of the Russian language. And those policies, those ideas sometimes drive violence, sometimes they drive other attempts, Russian attempts, to control Ukraine. But there is a central undercurrent here that, from the Russian perspective, we need Ukraine, we're entitled to Ukraine. We would rather take it by peace. If we can't take it by peace, we will do it through violence. And that's the history of violence and Russian domination that I'm trying to trace throughout the book, which is pretty stable over the last 200 years.
It's really interesting the way in the book you kind of tried to get to the roots of this. Like you started to describe it. Why is this happening? What's motivating this? And you kind of identify two main factors. The first being identity and the second being security. And I thought that was really interesting how you looked at those two things. They're separate but also connected, I suppose, in important ways. But maybe you could say a bit more about those factors.
I'm a political scientist by training. I teach in an international affairs school, so obviously I'm day and night exposed to the ideas and the arguments of people who look at NATO, who argue that the Russian invasion is just a result of NATO expansion, that we somehow, Ukraine, the West in Ukraine encroached on Russian natural sphere of interest, and it's just about security. So fix security, prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, make it neutral, and it will all be solved. And it's not new. In the 1990s, the idea was, make them give up any nuclear weapons that they have, and all the problems will go away. So my goal in this book is to show that security might be present, but security is never enough. Obviously, Russian state is very obsessed about security, but my argument is that identity, this sense of entitlement and ownership, the idea that Ukrainians are Russians with adjectives or maybe without adjectives, that Ukrainian is just a dialect of Russia, and Russia is a natural heir of the Kievan Rus. That's the key driver. It doesn't mean that security doesn't exist, but it's not necessarily the security as we understand it when we talk about NATO. It's more about regime security of the Russian state, the Russian elites, of the autocracy. And here the surprising thing that, it's essentially a catch-22. They fear democracy. And for them, Ukrainian democracy is a mortal threat. But the catch-22 situation is that it's a mortal threat because Russian elites perceive themselves that Ukrainians are the same as Russians. So they're forced by those identity beliefs to try to crack down and destroy Ukraine to prevent the regime, because they simply cannot take a step back and say, those are actually different people, and whatever they do with their regime is not a threat for us. But it's not a security in the international security sense that my colleagues have in mind when they talk about NATO. It's an identity war, and that's what I'm trying to show in this book.
Fantastic, Eugene. I really appreciated how you take the reader through this continuity of essentially Russian imperialism. But I'd like to focus on something else that really struck me in your book, and that's this question of intentionality of this violence that you describe. The book's title is Intent to Destroy, and this phrase comes from the definition of the crime of genocide, as quoted in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And of course, there's little doubt that Russia's current war against Ukraine has genocidal character, and intentionality to destroy Ukrainians as a group is absolutely evident in many crimes perpetrated by the Russian troops. Now, as you say yourself, you're not a lawyer, you are a political scientist. Why is this discussion of intentionality so important to you?
Well, I think it's important. It's important for several reasons. First, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a scholar of genocide, and genocide is not just a legal term, it's also an analytical term and a political term. And I think that the concept of genocide is too important to be left to the lawyers alone. And genocide, and it's important to focus on intention because essentially that's how you get to the motivations that Russian state and Russian government have when they started this war. Genocide is not about numbers. It's about the end goal of destroying an existence of a group, national or ethnic or racial. You can have a war or a campaign of mass murder that will have many people killed, but it will not be genocidal. I think the focus on intent goes exactly to what Russian state tried to achieve and tries to achieve in this war, and it doesn't really matter how many people, how many civilians are killed. What we have in our mind when we talk about genocide, we have the millions of the Holocaust, we have Rwanda, many people have the Holodomor in mind, of course, but those are multi-casualty events in which hundreds of thousands, millions of people being killed. What I try to show is that even though the numbers are different and luckily we're nowhere near the numbers of the Holodomor in the current war, the ideas are the same, and we need to understand what drives Russia if we want to stop it and if we want to prevent the next war. It's also a warning where it can go, and I think the potential for a much larger scale violence against civilians in Ukraine is still there. So I'm not using intent to destroy as a criteria to put individuals in jail. I'm using it more as an analytical term to get into what drives Russian state and its behavior in Ukraine.
So when we speak about genocide, we often, whether in the legal sense or in a non-legal sense, we often talk about the importance of recording and understanding the reasons for what's happening, how it's happening, the details of that. We do speak often about the importance of evidence, of documentation, of testimonies about what's happening. And this is where I want to turn to you, Sasha. And before we discuss the book, although this topic is very much related to what Victoria was doing in her book, which was collecting testimonies and speaking to people who've been through this experience of undergoing this occupation and experiencing the invasion. But first of all, tell us about your other role outside of the editing of this book, which is running an organization called Index, which we alluded to already, which documents the war, which documents the experiences of survivors. Tell us how you see the importance of that activity in right now.
Thank you for the question. So this new cultural and research institution, INDEX, Institute for Documentation and Exchange, was founded in Lviv in 2024. And basically its aims are in its name. It's documentation of various Ukrainian stories of the war, not war crimes in the strict sense of the word, because for that you would need some very specific legal training, which actually Victoria had, and we can talk about it a little bit later. But rather documenting experience of living through the war and living through genocide, and this documentation can take various forms. It can be film, photography, it can be literature, it can be intellectual reflection, or it can be oral history, some vehicles of documentation that we more naturally turn to when we think about it. Taking testimonies, recording them, keeping them in an archive, and saving them for the future. And we at Index try to connect various initiatives in Ukraine that are working in documentation, and there are hundreds of those. So annually we co-organize a symposium called The Most Documented War with the Center for Urban History in Lviv, which brings together more than 150 such initiatives. And this just shows you the scale and the scope of the task in front of people trying to basically keep the chronicle of this genocide in hope to achieve justice in the end. And we document these experiences while facilitating intellectual exchange, because we believe that it is through cooperation with intellectuals and thinkers and activists and doers from other parts of the world that we can work towards this justice. And this justice is not limited to a legal justice, to what can be achieved in courtrooms or like in jail cells, where we do want to see all the perpetrators of this genocide. But it is also justice in the ways in which the stories of Ukrainians are recorded, remembered, and passed on. And here we actually come to what Victoria Amelina was doing in her work. So she was a novelist and children's books author who in 2022 turned to investigating Russian war crimes. And she went through very specific training with an organization called Truth Hounds. She acquired very specific skills and went on fieldwork trips to various parts of Ukraine that are most affected by Russian war crimes, the occupied regions, frontline regions. And there she did take these testimonies. And while doing that, she also realized that she could use her skill as a writer, so that these stories are not only preserved as fieldwork reports, but are also turned into another form of witnessing, which can maybe reach broader audiences and bring broader awareness of what is going on in Ukraine. And this is what her book that we will talk about today, Looking at Women, Looking at War, is all about.
Yeah, well, why don't we talk about the book itself? You were at the heart of the group of people who had to essentially finish, piece together essentially that which Victoria left in various forms, some totally finished pieces and some completely unfinished pieces, blank pages, or I think you call them empty pages in the book. And it's an absolutely heartbreaking read, especially for those of us who knew Victoria. But I think anybody who will pick up this book will find it extremely emotional because it is published posthumously, because it sort of disintegrates as you read it, as you go through it. Tell us how you worked in a team and how the book came to be in the shape that it's in at the moment.
Yeah. So there was an editorial group of 4. It included Alex Amelin, Victoria's widower, Tatiana Teran, the former director of Pan-Ukraine, Victoria's close friend, Yarina Grusha, Italian translator, academic and writer, and another friend of Victoria and myself. I didn't know Victoria all too well, although we met in person. But I was invited to join this endeavor, and it was an honor for me to do so. What we inherited after Victoria's death in the aftermath of Russia's missile attack on Kramatorsk is basically a structure which was beautiful and very well outlined, and it showed her conceptual gift to conceptualize, to draw attention to the most important moments and to the most important testimonies. So she knew very well how the book will look like. She organized it very well. And then what we also inherited was parts that were very well written, parts at the beginning, parts at the end, which show her skill as a writer, her beautiful, ironic voice, very powerful way of storytelling. And in between, there were bits and pieces that Victoria hoped to finish during her residency in Paris, for which she was preparing. When she went to the east of Ukraine, to Kramatorsk, she basically had her ticket to Paris, where she would have been writing her book for a year. And I'm sure it would be the kind of writing that usually wins you a Pulitzer Prize or something like that. So the parts in between were consisted of some notes taken on her phone, of some interviews that were not deciphered, of some paragraphs that were in various state of being unfinished in various versions of her manuscript. And our job was to read through all of that and try to piece them together without intruding too much and not reading too much into the author's intent, because obviously it is very painful to try to finish something for the person who is no more. So we tried to preserve what was left by Victoria without interpreting it in any way. And where bits and pieces were missing, we included editorial explanations saying that, say, one fragment was unfinished. And I think that this form, both in its content and in the way it was composed, in its form basically, is another testimony of Russia's war crimes. It would have been a different book would Victoria be living, but now it testifies on a different level. This book itself is a very material, embodied, concrete testimony of Russia's genocidal intent in Ukraine.
Indeed, it's a document not only of war but also of a tragic death or murder of one of the people who was recording this war, which is fascinating. You did a fantastic job, your team did a fantastic job of preserving that document and letting us access it, which makes it all the more emotional. Now, it's important to say that Victoria wrote the book in English, so we get direct access to her voice, not via translation, which is unusual. And also, we have so many voices of other women in that book, even in its current forms. Some of them are not completed necessarily, but it's essentially looking at women looking at war. It's exactly what the title is. The war is often told through male voices and seen through male eyes. What perspectives are we gaining through this book that we perhaps are not gaining in, say, news coverage or other analysis?
Victoria was a feminist, so it was natural for her to turn to these stories which are not in the foreground of news coverage, as you say. And from her standpoint as a feminist, we get to hear the voices of, say, a brilliant lawyer who, on the day of the full-scale invasion, knew that she would join the army, and she enlisted, and she is still serving. It's Yevgenia Zakrevska. We get to hear the voice of a historian and writer who was once displaced from Donetsk in 2014, Olena Styashkina, and who, when Russia invaded all-out war in 2022 did not leave her second home, Kyiv. We get to hear from her as well. We get to hear from Alexandra Matviichuk, who now needs no introduction because she is the Nobel Peace Prize laureate from Ukraine, human rights activist, and a very powerful public intellectual these days. But Victoria gets to see her in the early days of the war when everything is very uncertain, and Alexandra works over time, just burning herself out, recording Russia's violations of international law, Russia's war crimes, and also advocating for Ukraine and for Ukraine outside of the country. And Victoria is next to her, traveling with her to Brussels and Paris, and seeing her in these vulnerable, but also moments that are full of internal strength that we know and love these women for. So she manages to get very close to her heroines, and I think this is one of her gifts, because she was really an empathetic human being, and it was her talent to make people open up and to give them full credit and to shine a light on their vital work. So through this book, we get to appreciate the work not only of Victoria, but of these other fantastic Ukrainian heroines that she knew.
It's so important that the book is documenting what's happening and what was happening at that time, kind of in real time, almost very much, responding to events as they were unfolding. It is a book about now, but it does have a historical kind of awareness in it. It does have her historical references. Victoria was very much, in her prose as well, she was very interested in thinking about the complicated and difficult history of Ukraine and how it resonates in the present. And in her non-fiction work in this book, she was also keenly aware of that. And one of the things that she writes about is the parallel between what was happening, for example, in the 1930s and what she saw happening in the occupied areas over the last 3 years. She refers to the so-called executed Renaissance. So this is in the 1930s, basically a whole generation of Ukrainian writers working in Soviet Ukraine were wiped out by Stalin, essentially. And a Renaissance because they had come back, Ukrainian literature and culture had really been reborn in the 1920s and then was very brutally destroyed, and many of the writers were killed. And this is something that Victoria kind of raises the spectre of in her work. She's saying, we could be facing another executed Renaissance. Could you tell us about those parallels and how you see them through Victoria's eyes, but maybe also through your own eyes, through what you do with Index?
Yeah, very good question. And as you say, she was among the first ones in Ukraine to put her finger on it. I think she said that we're living through this second executed Renaissance. In one of her articles, I think it was published in Eurozine back in 2022, which was very early. There is a moment in her book, a chapter which is called Berezil and Bucha. So Berezil is this avant-garde theater founded in the 1920s by Les Kurbas, a fantastic Ukrainian director and writer who was then killed in the 1930s Stalinist terror against Ukrainian intelligentsia and Ukrainian culture makers. Bucha is obviously the town in the north of Kyiv, which was occupied by the Russian army at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and which became the site of some of the most atrocious war crimes that we learned about at the beginning of the war, back in 2022. And Victoria writes about this chapter on the 31st of March 2022, which is the 100th year anniversary of Brazil, which, if not for the full-scale invasion, would be celebrated all over Ukraine. And all we would be talking about is the genius of our culture makers that finally we get to appreciate. But instead, what we are thinking about is the mass graves that are being uncovered in the north of Ukraine. And Ukraine is in the news, but for all the awful reasons, right? And now Ukraine gets a spotlight, but not because we finally get to appreciate some of the overlooked geniuses of Ukrainian literature and arts, but because Russia has again invaded the country, and it has become the site of a genocide. So it was the parallel reality was very, very much obvious to Victoria, and she tried to highlight it in her book, in her public speeches, and in her writing. And for her, it was very important to say that we don't get to talk as much as we should about Ukrainian arts and literature and achievements, because now all we have to talk about is basically survival. But I think that today we need to talk about both these issues, right? And to try to uncover those stories that remain buried, because Ukraine remains in the shadow of Russian imperialism for so long. And to draw out those names that maybe are not so familiar. We have just talked with you, William, about this in the train, that people should start appreciating the names they probably don't know for reasons of Russian imperialism, because Ukrainian culture was for years, for decades, for centuries under-resourced. And now probably is a good moment for some reckoning and some intentional attention to these names and to this culture.
Yeah, absolutely. This also resonates very much with Eugene's book. And, this precisely what you're saying, these stories of which need to be unearthed. And you are very much unearthing those stories in your book. And this question of the targeting of cultural figures is interesting. We can speak about this history of imperial aggression of Russia against Ukraine. We can speak about various wars that were fought. We can speak about the destruction of entire cities, as we've seen over the last few years. But one repeated aspect of this aggression against Ukraine come from the side of Russia is that cultural figures are targeted. So writers are targeted, theatre directors, artists, people who are active within society seem to be a particular target. And Victoria Amelina was one of those. And we know that the invading forces had information about people in the occupied areas who were these kind of activists or cultural figures who they might want to target, and they would arrest and get rid of. Eugene, could you speak to this question a little bit of the importance of cultural figures? And and I guess it's related to one of these aspects that you identified. We talked about security and identity. I guess this really speaks to the importance of identity and precisely backs up your argument that identity is so important, because these are the people who build the identity and who create the identity.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't think I'm unearthing any new stories. What I think I'm doing more is connecting the dots and showing continuities over time. And, that's obviously what Victoria Amelina did in her articles and her work, because we tend to think about, the executed Renaissance and, the ban of Ukrainian language in 1860s and the second half of the 19th century as somehow disconnected events, but we need to understand them as part of the broader Russian strategy to turn Ukraine into a fully Russified, even if little Russified land, and the Ukrainian identity is something which is subsumed within the larger Russian identity. And as you said, that's exactly how you do it. You don't go and target the peasants who speak the language because they're not seen as a threat. You go after people who create the language, who create the culture, who write, who talk to educated classes, who teach at schools. And that's what, from the very beginning, was the target of the Russian attempts to control Ukraine, to focus on the educated strata, on the artists, and just either give them a choice to switch to Russians and become Russians without adjectives, or to be banned from publications, to be repressed, and in some cases, like the executed Renaissance, to be killed or sent to prison. So there are degrees in variation in the levels of repression, but the goal is the same and the motivation is the same. Actually, two motivations. One is fear. And the fear is that if those people will be allowed, to teach in schools, to create their culture, to write those plays, to perform, then Ukrainian will become a recognized literary language, cultural language, and then people in Ukraine will adopt it as the language of their day-to-day conversation and of the writing middle classes, the elites. So the fear to prevent Ukraine from developing their own identity, and also quite a lot of contempt, like who they think they are. How dare they, to write in this peasant dialect? What are they wasting their energies and times on rather than speaking in Russian or writing in Russian, which is the real language of high culture? They should not be allowed to do it. And that's the combination that we see from, the banning of almost all Ukrainian books in 1860s to the late policies of the late Russian Empire. So, when I wrote this book, for me, the most eye-opening part of the story was the Russian occupation of Galicia and Bukovina during World War I, where the first thing that the Russian authorities did after taking over those areas is to ban Ukrainian publishing, to exile, the teachers, the cultural elites, to take them hostages, to target them, to ban the teaching of Ukrainian in schools, to start bringing teachers from Russia. And essentially, I would find myself, I was writing this in 2022, and I would find myself in this weird bit of schizophrenic state where I would read news from what Russia does in occupied territories in eastern Ukraine and go back to the historical accounts of what was happening in Galicia at that time. And the only difference would be the time and the place. Beyond that, it would be almost exactly the same policies of what Russia did. And obviously, in between, there was also the executed Renaissance and the attack on the Ukrainian education and the suppression of the Ukrainian language by the late Soviet authorities. But the goal is the same. The goal is to make those people feel Russian, speak Russian, and that's why so many people in Ukraine still speak Russian. So when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about my own family, my grandparents. All of them were born in Ukraine. For neither of them, Russian was their first language. For the generation of my parents and myself, of course, Russian was the language that we spoke because that's what people in the cities were forced to speak, and they did not have much exposure to the Ukrainian language. But it wasn't a natural process. It was a result of state policy to target those people and to take them out. So that's exactly the result that we see.
Gosh, Eugene, that sounds so familiar. I spent the entire 2022, I think, as a historian reading the news and thinking, wait a minute, I've seen this before. And I can see that Sasha's dying to say something here as well.
Just a thought on this Russification, cultural replacement, but also physical destruction of cultural figures. There is currently an initiative that is conducted by Index, but also by Pan-Ukraine, ZMINA, a number of Ukrainian institutions that are monitoring cultural losses among culture makers, basically those people whom Russia targeted and intentionally killed, intentionally removed. And sometimes these are people who were basically executed and punished precisely for their work in culture. It's, for example, the story of Kherson music director Yuri Karpatenko, who just refused to collaborate with the occupiers in the southern city of Kherson, and for this he was shot through the door of his apartment. Or it is the story of a very young cultural activist, shall we say, from Kharkiv, Nika Kozhushko, who was just 18 years old when she was killed in a Russian missile strike. And this was the young woman who was very much into Ukrainian culture, who read all the poets of the executed Renaissance, who was volunteering in Kharkiv Literary Museum, and who was this future that everyone enthused about in Kharkiv, that despite the fact that city is under the heavy bombardment, there are these young people who are actually bearing the torch and who will be creating Ukrainian culture today, tomorrow. And then what happens is Russia just bombs the city and kills them. I just wanted to highlight that there is actually work being done to document such cases, to verify them, to take interviews from family members and so on, so that this record also remains and maybe one day serves the cause of justice.
It's a really powerful project. Sasha, maybe you could just tell us, our listeners, how they can find this project online.
There is currently a website with literary portraits of such figures. It's called People of Culture, Taken Away by the War. But we are also preparing a new website with the monitoring, which will be much larger, and because more institutions are taking part in it now, and the press release will be out later this week. So basically, Killed by Russia is the short title, Ukrainian cultural makers.
Great, thank you. That actually leads me to the next question that is to both of you, or perhaps maybe to all four of us. We're all four happen to be scholars who do quite a lot of public-facing work. So we all work both within and outside of academia. And when I think of the causes of this war, I include shortcomings in the production and consumption of knowledge about Ukraine and about the wider region of East Central Europe. As scholars, in my view, I think we are responsible for our findings and for communicating the urgency of our findings beyond academic circles. And I'm particularly thinking here of those colleagues who have worked on Russia and could see all the signs of its imperialism and its aggression long before the first shot was fired by a Russian gun on Ukrainian soil. What are your views about responsible scholarship? Eugene, perhaps we can start with you.
Right. So, I can't say much about the UK or continental Europe. My entire career has been in American universities, but you're absolutely right that the view in the academia is Russocentric, and all the whatever happens in the region, whatever happens to Ukraine, is first being processed through Russian eyes and Russian perspective. It does not necessarily mean, a sign of people in academia being Russophiles. Some of them just make, career choices. If you want a job, you need to study large countries such as Russia, and then it leads you to process everything through Russia first lens. Some of them do it simply because they need or want to counter the Russian threat, because after all, Russia has nuclear weapons, it interferes in elections. I teach master students working for the government, in the US military, in various other organizations. They're not Russophiles, right? They see Russia as a threat, but that's why they want to understand Russia. But the implication of this, that the understanding of the region comes from this Russia first perspective. What we can do, I think, are several things. Is first to teach classes on Ukraine as much as we can. And what I saw is, at least in US academia, there was an increase in demand for knowledge about Ukraine, though of course Russia still overshadows everything. Also important to produce those books. And truth to be said, I'm also part of this phenomena that I descry and argue against. After all, the subtitle of my book is Russia's 200 years quest to invent Ukraine. So I put Russia first, but that's the only way to make people understand what's going on. And also probably philanthropy, raising money like you do with the Ukrainian Institute of London, to make sure that there are classes and positions that are being funded, because the governments are not going to do it on their own. They need help from the private sector, and they need outside help. That's probably the only way to switch the focus from Russocentric, and again, Russocentric does not necessarily mean Russophile, and to put other places in the region on the map as well.
Before we turn to Sasha with the same question, Eugene, in the introduction to your book, you tell a very complex story of the war essentially penetrating your classroom in ways that you could not have predicted. Can you share that story of essentially teaching someone who turned out to be a Russian spy with our listeners, please?
Right. So that's how the book came about actually. So when I started teaching in my current school, back when I was teaching in Washington, now I'm in our European campus in Bologna, I had a student who was a Brazilian with a degree, undergraduate degree from Trinity College Dublin, German roots, Irish accent, who took several of my classes. And then after he graduated in 2020, he came to me, asked for a recommendation letter for a job at the International Criminal Court, which I gave him. He was a good student. He did well in the class. Haven't heard from him for some time. And then in June 2022, when I'm in the middle of, writing, speaking, talking about the war in Ukraine, I get an email from a colleague that the person turned out who got a job at the ICC and was supposed to get there was outed as an undercover GRU, Russian military intelligence officer. It was a pretty surreal experience. It was tough. I mean, I remember reading the news and just the world going black around me. I don't remember how I finished teaching the class that I was teaching back then. But for me, it was also a sign that, they are preparing. There was a reason why a Russian intelligence officer was applying for a job at the ICC as early as 2020. Maybe they were not, planning the invasion of Ukraine, but they were certainly thinking about something that might need to give them access to the ICC. And for me, it was actually a moment when I decided that, that being an academic, being a nerd that I am, what can I do to fight back? I will write a book and donate the money to Ukraine.
Absolutely. I think it's really the best thing, the best response possible to that situation. Some things that you said about the US context, I think definitely resonated with me in working in the UK and within UK academia, or let's say working with the media in the UK, talking to publishers in the UK about various things. There is this perception that, big, powerful countries are the most important and the most interesting, and they need to have the most space. And quote unquote small country like Ukraine, which of course is not small at all, only deserves a small amount of attention, a small amount of space, which is one of the things that we really are trying to do with the Ukraine shelf, because we notice that that's absolutely reflected when you walk into any bookshop. You see shelves and shelves of books about Russian history, and then there'll be a very small section, maybe like half a shelf about Ukraine, often inside that Russian section. But there's also this kind of weird catch-22 situation whereby there's this perception that, well, people don't know about Ukraine, so they won't want to read about it and they won't want to study it. Like, for example, students want to study Russia because they know about Russia, and everyone knows about Russia. They don't know about Ukraine, so it's very hard to persuade a university to invest money into developing a program. When you speak to editors and publishers and ask them, maybe we can talk about these, like Sasha said, dig up these stories that have been hidden for so long and which are so fascinating, and people will want to read about them, but they say, well, people don't know about this, and people are...
What is Les Kurbas? I've
Exactly.
never heard such a name.
Exactly. People are uncomfortable.
Let's publish Dadavanya. Dadavanya is
Again,
fine.
another translation.
Yeah. So you get into this kind of weird catch-22 situation whereby we as producers of knowledge are not allowed to put in resources into producing the knowledge, and therefore the knowledge isn't there, and it's just it goes in this vicious circle.
And instead we get a 15th production of Chekhov on all London stages, like Olesya has just said, right? This is definitely the knowledge that we've missed. We've never seen a Chekhov staged in London, right? Why would we ever want to stage Les Kurbas? Nobody has ever heard about him and will never hear, right? Because there is all this gatekeeping going on.
And of course, if we are allowed an opportunity to produce that knowledge, it works. And I can testify from the Ukrainian Institute London side, when we have these courses in history, literature, culture, about the stat and film, our courses are completely oversubscribed. So the demand is absolutely there as long as we make that offer. But so often it's so hard to make that offer because it takes, like you say, it takes a lot to persuade the publishers, the academia and so on to open their horizons.
Yeah, to take a chance. And I think, like you say, my experience is that when students, for example, are exposed to Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, they really do find it interesting. They do want to study it. It's just, it hasn't been accessible to them. And I think the same is with, the readers of fiction and translation, theatre goers and so on. But we're in this very, difficult situation whereby things are invisible, so people can't see them. And unless we do something to make them visible, people won't be able to see them. And it kind of goes around in this, like I say, like in a vicious circle. But this is something that, Sasha, you and I have kind of been dealing with together at some point in the not so distant past, because you were working at UCL for a little while teaching Ukraine. You've had a chance to look at these problems from the perspective of Ukraine, obviously with your work now, but also from inside of UK academia and also, I guess, going all around the world. So, what's been your experience of this problem?
The experience of teaching the course that you authored at the UCL, which is Crossroads of Culture, which looks at Ukrainian cultures, at cultures in Ukraine, which is like Bessarabia and, Roma culture and Crimean Tatar culture, intersecting, cross-pollinizing each other, was absolutely a great opportunity for me to see my country from a new perspective and to make it fresh and appealing to a generation, to a group of students who I think will now disperse this stereotype of monocultural Ukraine, which I think has been very harmful for us for a very long time. And speaking of little nations, little countries that do not deserve attention, turning to Ukraine, this so-called little country was the one to vote itself out of the Soviet Union and leading to the Soviet Union's collapse, right? And this little country is now resisting the combined forces of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and probably sponsored and fortified by China. And if we do not study this so-called little country, we will not understand what kind of forces of resilience, what kind of resistance it can actually show. And we will still be focusing on Russia. We will still be reading Dadavanya, and we will still be fascinated by Natasha Rostova's First Ball without actually realizing the imperial nature of this country which consists of, more than 20 republics, and how it amassed such mass of land, how it conquered all these people will again remained behind the brackets. So I think that it is through studying all the cultures and all the countries around this deep black hole called the Russian Federation that we can actually gain some valuable knowledge going forward in the 21st century. And there are initiatives that are helping us to do that. There is this new exciting initiative called RUTA, which is an annual conference association which brings together the scholars of Eastern, Central Europe, North Caucasus, Baltic countries. Like it's a long list of geographies that is not focused on Russia, and they help us to understand all the cultures that have been overlooked for very long. And again, I think it is very important to gain some situated, embodied knowledge of these countries and of these geographies, and that's why at Index we try to invite people through open calls to join us on fellowships, such as Victoria Amelina Fellowship, actually, for creative nonfiction writers from Ukraine and abroad who will work on the individual projects on human rights, on exploring the consequences and the roots of Russia's war against Ukraine. And I think that by being there, by communicating with cultural research, academic communities inside the country, that people from the outside can actually gain some insights and some valuable knowledge that otherwise for them would not become so clear and so open. So yeah, if we want to see all these initiatives, we will, apparently. So we have to make an effort.
Absolutely. Well, I really hope that this conversation will contribute to encouraging our listeners to keep uncovering Ukraine and add the two books that we've been discussing today to their Ukraine shelf that is growing as we speak. Eugene Finkel's Intent to Destroy and Victoria Amelina's Looking at Women, Looking at War. And now the time has come to ask both of you for your book recommendations. Sasha, may we begin with you?
There is a new translation of an iconic Ukrainian text called Cassandra by Lesya Ukrainka, who is an absolutely fantastic Ukrainian playwright, writer, poet of the turn of the 20th century, who looked at various global problems, key motifs of European culture, say, through a feminist and anti-colonial point of view. So I really recommend this retelling of the myth of Troy from this perspective of a Ukrainian turn-of-the-century feminist writer.
And the book is translated by Nina Murray, and I am proud to say that Ukrainian Institute London awarded her a translation prize, and one of the jury members is in the studio before the translation was fully done and published by Harvard Ukrainian Institute. Eugene, what about you? What book have you brought to us?
So I'm not much of a fiction reader, unfortunately, but there is a recent novel that I can strongly recommend. It came out recently in English. The title is No Country for Love. It's been written by Yaroslav Trofimov, who is a Ukrainian-born journalist now working for the Wall Street Journal. He also wrote a wonderful nonfiction history book about the Russian invasion of Ukraine called Our Enemies Will Vanish. And this novel is a historical novel that is based roughly on the history of Yaroslav's family in Ukraine throughout 1930s, the Holodomor, the Stalin's repression, World War II, and the post-war period up to 1950s.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Eugene. So that's we've got Lesya Ukrainka and we've got Yaroslav Trofimov. So please add those books to your Ukraine shelf alongside Eugene's Intent to Destroy and alongside Victoria Amelina's Looking at Women, Looking at War.
We really hope that you've enjoyed this conversation. And once again, remember that there's already another episode that you can check out. And of course, many more to come.
And please spread the word about this podcast and keep an eye out for future episodes. And most importantly, keep reading about Ukraine.